Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that will enable you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. We are thrilled and honored to be joined today by Director of CSIS China Power Project Bonnie Glaser, founder and CEO of CHINADebate and former investment banker, diplomat, lawyer, and CIA spy, Malcolm Riddell, senior fellow at Hudson Institute and former NSC Senior Director for Strategic Planning Robert Spalding, and chair of the UC San Diego 21st Century China Center and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Susan Shirk. Our conversation on the future of U.S.-China relations will be moderated by Shira Lowenberg, Director, AJC Asia Pacific Institute. After we hear from our distinguished guest, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org. That's questions with an S at ajc.org. Shira, you have the floor.
Thank you. It's a real privilege to be with all of you and with our audience from across the world. As the director of AJC's Asia Pacific Institute, I'd like to take a few moments just to speak of the Institute. AJC recognized Asia's importance to Jewish and U.S. interests more than 30 years ago when the Institute was founded. AJC is the only Jewish organization with an institute that is solely dedicated to Asia. For more than three decades, we have been active in the region and across the United States in advancing our advocacy goals. This program, like others that AJC is offering on a spectrum of foreign policy issues, helps us all to better understand and address the issues facing us as Americans and as members of the global Jewish community. So I'd like to plunge right into the questions that we have. We have a lot for you. The first one I'd like to address is about the media coverage. There have been many allegations about China's obfuscation, censorship, and outright lying and disinformation campaign. Bonnie, I'd like for you first to address what do you say is behind China's disinformation campaign and what are its ramifications? What does this tell us about the Chinese Communist Party's strengths and weaknesses?
Well, thank you for having me on, Shira. I think China has ramped up its disinformation campaign as we are facing the COVID-19 crisis. And to a large extent, I think it begins with its domestic insecurities. There's no doubt that the Chinese leadership made mistakes early on in the COVID-19 outbreak in Wuhan, covering up information, suppressing the ability of doctors to get out information. And I think that they see it in their interest, as they have in other episodes, crises in the past, to try and blame foreigners. And so there's really been this aggressive campaign to blame the United States, and the US military has even been invoked as possibly bringing the virus to Wuhan when the army participated last October in this military competition that was held in Wuhan. So, you know, this is in part domestic, and they want to divert and deflect attention away from the fact that, yes, the virus probably did start in China. But I also think there's another objective, and that really is to just try and promote China around the world, China's narrative, China's championing itself as the next leader of the world, providing global public goods to many countries in need, and at the same time criticizing the United States and portraying democracies as being ineffective in responding to this crisis. And of course, if we look at the facts, we can see there are both democratic and autocratic countries that are not doing well. And then there are, of course, many democratic countries that are, in fact, responding quite effectively. If we look at, for example, South Korea, New Zealand, Taiwan, of course, are three very good examples of democracies that have responded effectively to the crisis. So I think that there have been both domestic and foreign policy drivers behind China's disinformation campaign.
Rob, there has been a story that's been gaining traction in the United States and across the world over the last few days about the origins of the virus in Wuhan as not being from the wet markets, as was originally proposed, but possibly being from a virology lab located not far away from that. What do you make of these reports and their potential implications of the accusation itself, and if it does eventually prove to be true, what are the ramifications of that?
Well, I don't think we're going to know for a very long time what the ground truth is. Of course, I doubt we're going to have, our researchers are going to have access to the P4 lab or the researchers that were doing work there, or any of the real data that we would need to verify where the viruses come from. That being said, we do have some information that we do know. We do know that they were working on bat-related coronaviruses there. We know also they were doing gain of function research. We also know that in 2018, the State Department sent a cable talking about the lack of security precautions at the lab. So there are a lot of, all the science reports that I've seen about the origin of the virus have been based on a lot of conjecture. I think the only facts that we have right now are the ones that I've seen. So we're dealing with a bat-related coronavirus here as the chief cause of the pandemic. So other than that, though, I doubt we're really going to know for certain where that came from.
Susan, there has been a lot of finger pointing between the United States and China about who is to blame, who's doing well, what the responses are. Last week, you spearheaded a letter calling for cooperation. Could you talk a little bit about that and what your perspective on this issue is?
Sure, thanks for asking about that. What we did is gather together almost 100 former officials from Republican and Democratic administration, as well as China-Asia heads, to simply call for clear-eyed, pragmatic coordination and cooperation with China to save lives. So, there's going to be a lot of investigations and debates about how things started and who's to blame, but this is not the time for that. It's obvious that if the two largest economies in the world can't get on the same page in coordinating their effort, it's going to result in loss of life in the United States as well as in China and other countries. Excuse me, my phone rang, unfortunately. Let me just mention quickly how we're going to lose lives if we can't find a way to cooperate, as China and the United States have in the past on epidemics, even when they were at odds over many different issues, just as the Soviet Union and the United States joined together to completely eradicate smallpox during the Cold War. But we need to do the same thing today because, for one thing, there's so much red tape in getting medical supplies, originally from the US to China and now from China to the United States and other countries, that we need to clear that away. Secondly, we need to work together to develop, test, and figure out a fair way to distribute the vaccine. This is a good time to do that because we don't know which team is going to really come up with the best vaccine. So this is a perfect time to do what we've done in previous epidemics, which is figure out a fair way where the vaccine should go first. It's not just US and China, but this is a global challenge that the whole world needs to participate in. And if other countries do not see the US and China able to coordinate their effort here, they're going to be much more hesitant to contribute to the global effort that we need. And we see the result of this. We see the G20, the G7, none of them are operating effectively. And a large part of that is because the US and Chinese governments can't seem to have just the minimum of coordination of effort, put other disputes aside for the time being, put the question of, you know, how it started aside for the time being, and simply coordinate their effort.
So it would seem to me that there would be little disagreement, and correct me if I'm wrong, that right now the focus needs to be on saving lives and on cooperation. But moving ahead, hopefully there will be a vaccination, there will be treatment that's found very soon. Moving ahead, there are very different perspectives on how the US-China relationship will move forward. Malcolm, if you could address that, and then perhaps if others want to chime in with the different perspectives of how the current consensus, perhaps, that there needs to be greater cooperation, how that's going to pan out when we look at the other issues that underlie the relationship that preceded the pandemic and that will continue.
Thank you, Shira. Just following a little bit on Susan's point, not only is the lack of cooperation that we're seeing now a problem today, but this is not going to be our last pandemic. And so if we don't want to set the precedent for not having good cooperation with those who can help in a worldwide effort. So I applaud Susan's efforts. So far as the state of relations today, well, we know they weren't good really before all this started. And what we ended up with in the Trump administration, I think, was building a consensus among both parties and probably a large part of the American people that China needed to be confronted. Now, we chose to confront China through trade and tariffs, which may or may not have been the most effective way. We chose to do it without allied cooperation, which is clearly not an effective way. And it seems to me that what we accomplished, besides a few good points in the phase 1 trade deal, was to put the relationship on a very difficult path to going forward. There's a lot of talk of decoupling. I was talking to Craig Allen yesterday at the US-China Business Council, and he made a good point. He says, you can't have decoupling if you were never a couple. So if you look at and I think the point there is that we're dealing with two completely different systems of government, of social organization, and a view of trade. So we're bound to have lots of tension. The question now is, and we're seeing it play out here with the coronavirus, COVID-19, is do we want to have a total lack of cooperation going forward, or do we want to begin to find the elements where we can begin to have some good relations and improve the relations? To a great extent, this is going to depend on the outcome of the next election. I think we still see that President Trump is even in the face of the economic crisis that we're getting from the pandemic, he's elected to leave all the tariffs that he had most of the tariffs he had in place. And this doesn't send a good signal to China. It doesn't show that we're putting out our hand saying, hey, we know you're having a difficult time economically, let us help. And it doesn't encourage China to give us a lot of cooperation either. So I think the relations are fraught. And to tell the truth, in the current environment, I don't see a way for them to get better. But I'd be really interested in what my other panelists have to say.
Shira, could I jump in?
Yes, please.
So with all due respect to Craig Allen, I'm not sure that I buy or see the relevance of saying that we were never a couple, so we can't decouple. I would look at it a little bit differently. The US and Chinese economies are very, very interdependent. And this, of course, has developed over a period of decades. And I don't think that you can make an argument that there have not been significant benefits to both of our societies of that interdependence. That said, there are also risks. And the growing strategic competition between the United States and China have really uncovered some of those risks, and the COVID-19 crisis in particular, that there are areas where supply chains that are based in China, that are really directly connected to and have an impact on the national security of other countries, and this is not just the United States, perhaps should be diversified, and in some cases, maybe not be in China. Clearly, China has become the manufacturer for the world of medical supplies and equipment. Lots of countries around the world are now saying that they should be producing more of these items at home. This is not just the United States. So we're going to see more indigenous manufacturing in these areas. The issue of decoupling arose, I think, primarily because of the focus on Chinese telecoms and whether or not they should be selling equipment to countries' 5G networks. And obviously, there are many countries that are deciding that there are risks involved. And maybe just because Huawei produces cheaper goods and maybe is a bit more advanced in some of the technologies, that we should not be relying on them. And this is, of course, countries like Japan and Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And some other countries have yet to make decisions in that regard. So I don't think our two economies are going to stop trading with each other. So I don't think really we should be looking at this as a complete decoupling. And I think in many ways that interdependence has just been beneficial for the US and for China.
Rob, do you wish to comment on?
Well, yeah, I mean, so from my perspective, you know, just going back to the national security strategy, it was clear that international institutions were no longer promoting democratic principles, rule of law, self-determination, human rights, civil liberties, free trade, you name it, whether it's a World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, the UN Human Rights Council, or the UN itself. All of these things have begun to, all these institutions have begun to actually promote a worldview that's more consistent with the worldview that the Chinese Communist Party espouses than that of free countries. And so the realization was we needed to get back to, you know, promoting those and working with our allies and partners. So in opposition to what's been reported, there's actually been a steady stream of diplomacy with our allies and partners on a bilateral basis since the first quarter of 2018, a steady discussion about what does it mean with globalization and the internet when you incorporate the #2 economy that repudiates essentially all of the founding principles of that international order. And really, what do we need to do as democracies to come together to shore up our economies, to shore up our societies, and then to work together to actually get these institutions to function as they should. You know, if the WHO had spent more time listening to Taiwan than the Chinese Communist Party, we probably wouldn't be dealing with a global pandemic today. So we have a number of challenges that the Chinese Communist Party is not interested in cooperating with us on, despite the fact that we have been over the past 3 decades imploring them, not only imploring them, but also helping them grow in power so that they threaten not only ourselves, but our democratic allies and partners in the very institutions that we created after the end of World War II to actually promote democracy and freedom and free trade around the world.
Susan, I want to give you an opportunity before I move to the next question. Did you want to respond to that?
I don't know whether to talk about international institutions or decoupling, but I guess I'll flag one of the most important features of the interdependence between the United States and other countries, including China, which is talent. What really makes America great, in my opinion, I always say, what makes America great? What do I really love about America? Immigration and public libraries. These are always the two things I think are really great about America. And immigration, and in particular, having talented Chinese come to the United States, study here at our world-class universities. Many of them prefer to stay start new companies, become academics, and the effort, the national security focus, and the great concern about leakage of technology to China, some of it obviously completely illegitimate and really deserves to be called theft. And some of it is just people learning stuff and going back to China and setting up laboratories and this kind of thing. So as a result, so many Chinese Americans, so many Chinese people from the PRC, from China, from Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, they are feeling under the shadow of suspicion and the pressure under the Trump administration, this kind of counter-espionage campaign has really had some very negative consequences. So one of the features of interdependence that I feel is absolutely vital to American competitiveness is that we continue to be able to attract talent and we don't hound ethnic Chinese people out of the United States. And I might mention that the worsening of US-China relations is having a very direct impact on Chinese Americans right now. There's a lot of violence and harassment of Chinese Americans because of the rhetoric of the Trump administration that has been blaming China for causing the illness in the United States. So talent is the key ingredient to American competitiveness.
If I might just jump in on your last note about the anti-Chinese and anti-Chinese American rhetoric, just to point out that AJC over the last 2 months has come out very strongly in support of the Chinese community here in the United States, as well as Chinese American community and Asian American community, because it's more than the Chinese American community that's been targeted. And we have come out with letters of support and written many op-eds showing Jewish support for opposition to this issue. I think Rob.
That's great.
Right, I totally agree with Susan. I think one of the great strengths of America is our diversity, the fact that we come from a background of immigration, and most importantly, that leads to talent. And that really explains why the Chinese Communist Party created the 1,000 Talent Program to harvest that talent from the United States. Recently, we had the indictment of the head of the chemistry department at Harvard University, not a Chinese American, but was recruited by the Chinese Communist Party for the research he was doing for the Department of Defense. And so that research was also given to the People's Liberation Army. What we face is a regime, a totalitarian regime that's not afraid to use the People's Armed Police, the Ministry of State Security, and the Ministry of Public Security to include all of their technology, which includes platforms like WeChat to spy on their citizens. So the specter that's overhanging many Chinese that are living in the United States are not the United States. It's really the Chinese Communist Party, who will use any and all means to get the knowledge that they have access to. So we actually want to separate, and talk about the fact that we have a Chinese Communist Party that's really the problem. It's not the Chinese people. The Chinese people are a subject of this problem, of this regime, and the harsh measures don't end at their borders. They extend. We have had in this country Ministry of Public Security and Ministry of State Security officials running around doing rendition. So the idea that Chinese have more to fear from America than the Chinese Communist Party, I'm sorry, is just preposterous.
I'd like to take the opportunity, thank you, Rob, just to go back to the current pandemic. And Malcolm, if you could address how this, does this pandemic change the geopolitical map in terms of China's rise? Ultimately, does this pandemic and China's response to it help its reputation or damage its reputation globally?
Here, I think there are a couple of aspects there. The first is a great part of China's rise, as we know, is economic. And I'm old enough to remember back when Ezra Vogel wrote, "Japan is number one." And of course, Japan's not number one today. Will China be number one going forward? Well, it does remain to be seen, but China was already facing a weakening economy, and the pandemic, of course, added to that. Now in the recovery, their supply is improving, but external demand is still weak and will continue to be weak as long as Western economies are not buying. If China doesn't have the economic might, then it cannot go to the second part of this, and that is to expand beyond its borders, its influence beyond its borders. Whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative in the South China Sea, although I think the resources would go there just as it did during the Cold War with the Soviet Union into military issues. So the pandemic has the potential, I'll leave it there, but the pandemic has the potential for taking an already weakening and troubled economy with the heavy debt load that it has to make it more difficult for China to compete with the US and other countries. If you also look internally, there's been, who knows what the outcome will be, but if you look at the pandemic and China's response internally to it and the protests that we saw bubble up on social media that was put down, that this also could be a source at least of some tension within the country, which could lead to even a harsher regime. I subscribe to a great deal of what Rob said about the Chinese people being subject to the Chinese Communist Party. And so that gives a fragility to the internal politics. So we've got these two issues that are affecting China coming out of this. Now, is China going to have the model as it's promoting around the world of both response and a political system that is better to deal with these kinds of things? There was an excellent article talking about the problems of autocratic government and one-person rules we may or may not have, depending on your perspective with Xi Jinping, being able to export that model. And it's a fragile model and it's not easily exportable. I think as the point's been made, the U.S. is in Reagan's words, the shining city on the hill. The light may be a little dim right now, but it's we're still there. And so I see in the long run that we are still very well positioned vis-a-vis China within the world. China is going to has a rightful place in the world community. It needs to adapt probably much better to the way that we are dealing in the world community, and the world community needs to make adjustments given China's unique model. We've seen that in the WTO, which has in many ways been a failure to adapt.
Bonnie, would you like to comment on that in terms of a regional perspective, how the China's neighbors are responding to China's behavior right now, the questions about the way that it first addressed the outbreak in China, and then now touting itself as a humanitarian actor in the world?
Well, countries around China, I think, have lived with China as a neighbor for centuries. And there's very little love lost there. Countries don't want to be in a region that is Sinocentric, that is a sort of sphere of influence of China, where countries have to defer to Chinese interests. But there are many small countries that face pressure from China all the time to respect Chinese interests. And this is, of course, all predates COVID-19. Right now, I think countries are just really domestically focused. They have a huge health crisis. There are probably very few countries that are really well equipped to handle the crisis. And I already mentioned Taiwan and South Korea. Japan, of course, has growing numbers. We'll see how bad it gets there. But you have many countries in Southeast Asia, I think, who are really, really poorly equipped to deal with very large numbers of cases. And so countries want help. They want the economic assistance from China. There are ongoing Belt and Road projects that have probably ground to a halt. Some of these countries would like to see them resumed so that they can finish the things that China was building, whether it's high-speed rail or ports or things like that. But there's a lot of mistrust in the region toward China. Yeah, countries really don't want to be in a position where they have to choose, though, between the United States and China. They really, generally, for the most part, support a strong U.S. military presence, especially countries like Vietnam, where Chinese Coast Guard ships are constantly putting pressure on them. There was just an incident about 2 weeks ago where allegedly there was a Chinese law enforcement vessel that sunk a Vietnamese fishing ship. But we see the presence of these what we call white-hulled ships, law enforcement vessels, in the exclusive economic zones of Indonesia and Malaysia. They can now operate 24/7 in the South China Sea because they can easily resupply at the military bases that have been built on these, what used to be these very tiny reefs that have been substantially expanded. And that has provided an ability of China to try and really intimidate and exercise administrative control over the area. So that has, I think, been a concern of many countries. But right now, I think a lot of those issues are just on the shelf, right? As countries are focusing on the pandemic and trying to provide assistance to their citizens.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to take the prerogative to take one more question before I turn it over to my colleague Daniel, who will be taking questions from our audience. My last question, I'm going to start with Susan, but then anyone is welcome to take it. It's about our upcoming presidential election. On China-U.S. relations, what are the issues or policies that we should be paying attention to, the differences between the two political parties and perhaps the candidates? So Susan, please start us off.
The Trump administration, and by the way, this is not so much President Trump himself, who still says a lot of very flattering things toward Xi Jinping, but the rest of the administration has basically pursued a policy of confronting China. There's no real end game. I mean, what's the objective? What are we trying to do? And when people like me and Bonnie, we have the opportunity, and Rob and Malcolm, we have the opportunity to talk to people in the Trump administration. And we often ask that question: what are we actually trying to achieve? Are we trying to get China, regime change in China? Are we actually so hubristic that we think that we can bring about regime change in China? Or are we trying to get China, are we focusing on particular priorities, ways in which the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese system, and the Chinese leadership is really harming American interests and values? So I would expect that a Biden administration will be equally tough on China, equally critical. The China issue is generally one where you get bipartisan views. It's not like one party's tougher and the other is softer. But I think that a Biden administration, spoken as a lifelong Democrat, will be more pragmatic and will identify the priorities and figure out ways that a combination of carrots and sticks and some reassurance and some high-level discussion. I mean, right now, under the Trump administration, there's almost no communication channels between our governments other than actually the militaries. oddly, is the one area. But I think the Biden administration will be more focused, more disciplined, more pragmatic in terms of trying to actually get China to make the changes that we seek. And the other way that I think a Biden administration will be different is that they will recognize that despite the differences in our system, despite all of our many disputes, there are certain overriding issues like this pandemic and future pandemics and global climate change. So we need to find a way to compete but coexist and to protect a space for coordination of effort.
Thank you. Does anyone else, any other panelists wish to comment on the difference of perspective between parties or candidates?
I think, I would just like to say a couple things on pandemic. Clearly the pandemic itself, we don't know the origin of the virus, but the origin of the pandemic is the Chinese Communist Party, because they covered up the fact that they had human-to-human transmission until those 5 million people left Wuhan. And then in terms of climate change, the Chinese continue to add capability for coal-fired electricity within China and produce 30% of the carbon. So the idea that the Chinese have any interest in solving any of these problems in the same manner as a international order that wants democratic principles, free trade, rule of law, civil liberties, human rights is just on its face, it's false. And we recognize that. And that's why in the national security strategy, we chose a policy of working together with democracies to isolate the influence of this terrible, terrible regime on international institutions and democratic systems.
Thank you. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Daniel, who is taking questions from our audience. Daniel?
Thank you, Shira, and thank you, everyone. Our first question comes from API board member Amy Reagan in Seattle, and this can go to Bonnie and Susan. How does China view statements by our administration calling COVID-19 a, quote, China virus? Do they see this as a political statement in the domestic political context, or on the larger geostrategic context of US as a global leader versus China's global interests? Bonnie, if you want to go first.
Sure, I'll start quickly. I'm sure that Susan has things to add. So first, to be correct, President Trump called it a Chinese virus, not a China virus. And Secretary of State Pompeo and others, I think, have occasionally called it the Wuhan virus. We should at least acknowledge that there are guidelines that are put out by the WHO that, as strongly recommended, this is not new, it's not pertaining just to the COVID-19 virus, that strongly discourages the use of any kind of label for a virus that indicates anything about origin or ethnicity. I personally think it's very important to get at where this virus started, but I'm going to leave that to epidemiologists, because I don't think that political scientists are going to be able to get the answer to that question. So I think that the Chinese were very worried about the president calling this a Chinese virus, and my guess is that the Chinese viewed this as part of what they have always talked about as a larger containment strategy that the United States is seeking to prevent China's rise. And so by blaming China, they probably think that the United States is trying to forge an anti-China coalition and get the Chinese people to perhaps protest even their own government. And maybe turn against the Chinese Communist Party. I'm not saying that that was the goal, but I think that probably the Chinese saw it that way initially. They haven't seen what they see as a lot of positive signals coming from the Trump administration. So they, of course, put this in the context of the other things that they have seen. And I think that they found it quite worrisome. And let's just, since nobody has mentioned, I'll just add that we did have a statement very early on in this epidemic by our, I believe it was our Commerce Secretary, who said that this would provide the COVID-19, before it was even called COVID-19, the virus would provide a great opportunity to pull supply chains out of China. So, you know, the Chinese were reacting to things that they heard from the Trump administration early on, but they were certainly putting it in a much broader context. And I'm not saying necessarily this was the way that it was intended, because I don't know the answer to that question, but that's how I would guess the Chinese view it.
Thank you. So I'll move on to our next question, actually, which is somewhat along the same lines. And this comes from another API board member in Seattle, Murray Lee, who asked that they'd like for you to comment on the rising xenophobia in China, and as to whether it's just a manifestation of this crisis or more endemic to a national propaganda campaign aimed at bolstering domestic support for the Communist Party and its narrative. So Malcolm, if you want to start there.
Yes, well, from everything that we can see from the Chinese press and media, there has been for some time, and the attempt to portray the U.S. as the enemy to this has gone often. It fits and starts for decades. If we go back to bus protesters to the U.S. Embassy, to all sorts of things, other actions. So yeah, I would say that to the extent that this kind of xenophobia is present, that the government had a great hand in putting it out there, and it was done for its own purposes of maintaining its power, presenting a nationalist argument to its people, and allowing them to see somebody other than their own government as the sources of problems.
Susan, would you like to respond to that question as well?
Unfortunately, the leaders of both countries are deflecting blame from themselves, from their own mistakes, onto other countries, other governments. In our case, the World Health Organization, governors. I mean, President Trump is trying to he's flailing around, it looks like to me, to try to find people to blame, other than acknowledging his own mistakes, including, by the way, at an early stage, praising China for its transparency and effectiveness at managing the pandemic. The words from President Trump's mouth were very much similar to some of the things that the head of the WHO said. But now President Trump is defunding the WHO just at the time that we need international platforms to try to coordinate effort to address the pandemic. So this is defensive blame game, and it just, it looks like playground fights to me. And it's a time that we really need a little more pragmatism at doing what we need to save lives.
I'd like to jump in on actually a point that Susan just made with the WHO, and to ask others to comment. What kind of signal do you think our president's announcement about the freezing of funds, what kind of signal is that sending to the Chinese and also to the global community?
Well, can I just say a word or two about that? I thought the long article in the New York Times today was, going through the whole history of what WHO did. I mean, it's clear, and Rob, I think, mentioned that the Chinese have made a big effort to get their folks into these international organizations. They've played the game better than we've played the game. We have basically not paid enough attention to UN organizations, even though we're the biggest funder, and we don't send people out there to staff these organizations. So I think it sends a terrible signal to be attacking the WHO at this point in time. The WHO needs more American support, more American involvement, and certainly the rest of the world needs the WHO. So trying to blame the WHO looks like a pretty desperate action on the part of the United States that will only harm our reputation as a global leader.
Malcolm, you had a comment.
Yeah, I have 2 points. The actions toward the WTO, Jamie Metzel had a great line in an essay he wrote where he said, defunding the WHO in the middle of a pandemic is a little like being on a flight and shooting the pilot, you know? And the second point is, of course, I agree with everything that Susan said, but we have to look at the Trump way of doing things. How has he kept control of Congress, of the Senate, of these, and his members? It's fear of bringing his base against them, so nobody speaks up, even with a good principled argument. In the same way, what can you do if you aren't, as has been well noted, that you're not willing to take leadership positions in these international organizations you're creating? And I agree a great deal with Bob. They're not doing their job. But is the idea that we just simply abandon them, or do we try to reform them from within? What is the best way to strike fear into an international organization is to defund it. So the next time any international organization considers doing anything that is contrary to President Trump's interests, then there's always the threat of defunding if he's dissatisfied. And I don't think that's the way to run the world order.
Before turning it back to Daniel, I just want to emphasize that AJC is a nonpartisan organization.
Right.
Thank you.
I would just.
I normally do not get into the partisan issues, but you asked us, so I had to answer frankly. Sorry.
I would like to just, talk about the WHO itself and, how China is able to gain political influence in international institutions. It's really about, a whole of nation effort to garner influence among the many constituents of that international institution. And so it is not true that we have not been playing the game. It's just the way that we play the game doesn't come with financial inducements that are given both at the country level and at the individual level. And clearly that has been successful in corrupting many international institutions today. And not only international institutions, a lot of domestic political institutions as well, not just in the United States, but around the world. And so we have to recognize that geopolitics today in a globalized, internet-connected world is far less about bombs and bullets of the 20th century and far more about data and economics and the influence that it allows you to create in these institutions. And when you look at the $800 billion we spend per year in defense, you have to begin to think, how do we create more influence in terms of democratic principles and values in the international order in the 21st century? It's not with F-35s. We really have to be smarter about how we engage diplomatically, economically, financially, politically, across the board. We have to think differently. The world operates differently. The Chinese Communist Party recognized this, took advantage of it, have done a fantastic job of using it to their advantage, but it has been to the detriment of all the values and principles that we hold dear. It is interesting that we have not spoken, not even once, about concentration camps and organ harvesting, which goes on in China. So this is a kind of regime that we collectively support when we don't recognize what's going on in both in our domestic institutions and in our international institutions.
Can I say one quick follow-up? Rob, I think, made a very good point about our views of what really constitutes national security. And one of the really interesting questions about the future is, as fiscal budgets get constrained, and they sure will be in the United States, in China, are we going to want to reduce defense spending? Because we now see that the health of our people and other types of public goods, some kind of resilience when people are struck by pandemics and lose their incomes. Are we going to see that that has become more important than the more traditional military security? So it'll be interesting to see whether or not you get that trend in the United States or in China.
Thank you. Daniel, back to you for a couple more questions.
Bonnie, here's a question for you from David in Hong Kong. Do you foresee further skepticism of globalization as a result of this crisis and the increasing reassertion of the nation state, where it is every state for itself, the importance of control of borders, and its own self-interest? And what does that mean for the liberal world, rule of law, and democracy?
Well, I think there's already been a trend even before COVID-19 to some extent of deglobalization. There's been several people who have written about this. In some ways, the world is globalized, but in other ways, there have been more attention. For example, if you look at trade patterns, intra-regional trade in the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific has been growing dramatically. So I think that countries are going to, as I said earlier, think about their supply chains, which ones should be located in their own countries that are closely linked to national security. But then there are going to be some countries, and China is going to be one of them, that will continue to press for preserving and strengthening globalization. And that's because China has benefited enormously, more than any other country in the world, from globalization. And if China is cut off in some ways from the rest of the world in these supply chains, for example, then that's going to be harmful to the Chinese economy. So I think you're going to see different countries react differently. It's difficult to isolate that particular factor in terms of its impact on the future of the international order. There are lots of variables that are going to affect the future of the international order. And I would associate myself with many of the things that Susan said earlier, and also Rob said about what China's objectives are in the international order. And Rob talked about advancing a different set of norms and values, certainly in the area of some institutions. China has said very clearly it doesn't support the Western norms. It doesn't support Western alliances. Those are pieces of the international order that I think the United States and other countries view as deeply, inextricably linked to what the international order is today. And the Chinese have a very different view about what the international order is. And they have been trying to insert more autocratic norms. And we see this at the United Nations in the area of internet governance and in the Human Rights Council, which China now, of course, has a seat on, and the United States has withdrawn from. So these are, the implications for the international order are going to be very important going forward, but we need to have policies as a country, along with our allies, to strengthen what we see as the underpinnings of the international order. At the same time, we're going to have to find some ways to work with China inside of this international order and put up some perhaps firewalls to the extent that we can that prevent the Chinese from undermining the international order and changing it to our disadvantage.
Thank you, Bonnie. Malcolm and Rob, I have one final question before I turn it over to Shira to conclude, but this comes from an AJC leader in Massachusetts, Irv Kempner, who asked, will the reality of the current pandemic crisis, global competition, and overdependence on China result in new bipartisan effort to bring back production to America? Malcolm, if you want to begin.
I think we're bipartisan, often hard to say, but there's no question there is an attempt to make this case that it is time to build more resilience and redundancy into the supply chain. Will that redundancy and resilience be built by bringing manufacturing back to the U.S.? In some cases, yes, but it's very difficult to see that across the board. Is a wiser policy to be certain that our vital, that the elements of the supply chain that are vital to our national interests are being manufactured in countries that we have some influence over, or countries which are our allies, rather than one that is a potential enemy and one that could, in a pinch, cut off supply chains, its supply of vital elements to the U.S.
Absolutely. I think we're going to see a reintroduction of indigenous supply chains, but I also agree that we need to also think about in terms of democratic secure supply chains. So how are those democracies, that those like-minded nations that value the same freedoms and free trade that we do, how do we work with them to actually secure the supply chain? Because it's not just indigenous production we also need the ability to trade between and amongst democracies to promote their economic growth and their national security, and ultimately their democratic principles.
Thank you. Before we conclude, I just wanted to give everyone an opportunity to make very, very brief remarks if there are any final thoughts that you have based on our conversation, or thoughts that you'd like to leave our audience with. Susan, I'll start with you.
Well, I have been very focused on one clear objective, which is how do we find a way for our two governments to coordinate their efforts to save lives in both of our countries and the rest of the world. And one idea that seems a little bit far out, but I'll float it here. Let's create a channel between the Vice President Mike Pence and the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang. They are both the heads of the task forces working on the epidemics in their respective countries. Why are they not talking to each other regularly and clearing away the political and bureaucratic roadblocks so that they can coordinate their efforts to get medical supplies here, to help the developing world, which is really going to be hit very hard, and to have a plan for the development, testing, and fair distribution of vaccine and therapies. Seems like a no-brainer to me. I just don't understand it.
Malcolm?
I think that's a terrific point, Susan. It seemed to me, even before President Trump was elected, that the world order needed some corrections. I'm certainly not in favor of the sort of total collapse, but I think some adjustments from within. And part of that is our being able to adapt to to use Rob's terms, the democratic countries being able to adapt to up to this point, ever increasing, powerful, and perhaps even not inimical to our interest country like China. So you're in a situation now where with the pandemic, we kind of can hit pause. And the point's been made, I think Susan made the point that we don't have a strategy with an end game, with a result that we're trying to get. Maybe now we have an opportunity to take a step back to reform our policy, our objectives, and decide how we want to engage with China. I certainly won't speak for any part of the administration now or coming, but I think right now the sort of floating way that we're dealing with China is got to end, and this is a good time to begin to have a reset.
Thank you. Rob, would you like to share your concluding thoughts?
Yeah, I think we probably need to spend a little bit more time thinking about the Chinese people who are the subjects of this repressive regime. You know, one of the things that we've stopped doing, I think that we used to do quite well, was talk about democratic principles and human rights, and particularly provide an alternative narrative for the Chinese people to consider. And I think we've given up on penetrating the firewall. We've defunded most of, American global media enterprise to push VOA and Radio Free Asia into China. And I think we need to rethink how we address public diplomacy globally, and really begin to think about the importance of talking about what America stands for, what we are trying to maintain, or actually return to in the international order, because we've gotten so far away from democratic principles and human rights and free trade. So I think it's incumbent upon us to think differently about national security, and certainly how we project ourselves into the world. And this is a great opportunity to really reflect on the Chinese people and what they've had to endure and what they will continue to endure until this horrible regime no longer, is essentially repressing them.
Thank you. And Bonnie.
So I'll just make two quick points. Since Rob just mentioned media issues, I want to underscore how detrimental it is to, I think, both the United States and China to have had the journalists that were expelled from China. And I understand the Trump administration is trying to apply a sort of principle of reciprocity. I think there's a lot of problems in doing that, because none of the Chinese media representatives in the United States, as far as I'm concerned, are real journalists. So I'm not sure we should actually be looking at this through the lens of reciprocity. Maybe we should take some actions against them or limit them, but to try and equate this to what our journalists do in China, I think is not right. And I think the Chinese really overstepped in expelling these journalists. I believe that they benefit the interests of China, not just those of the United States and other countries. And then lastly, I would say that in addition to the COVID-19 pandemic, we really face now an economic crisis. Let's remember that after the global financial crisis, we did not have a global recession, but now that is what we face. And I think that obviously the US and China are the two world's biggest economies. We did coordinate our stimulus, for example, in 2008, 2009. The G20 is trying to work together in this regard. But we're going to end up with countries that come out of this crisis with their economies intact. China's still forecasting that it's going to grow this year by just under 2%. But as Susan said, we're going to have a lot of countries that are developing countries that are just going to be hit incredibly hard. So we need to be encouraging China to forgive the debt of these countries. And whether or not it's connected to COVID-19 is a different issue. But I really think that we have to be working together to strengthen the global economy going forward.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for joining us for this hour for what was not only an informative but extremely illuminating conversation. I'm going to turn it back to my colleague Daniel to close off the program. Thank you again to our panelists and to our audience.
Thank you, Shira, and thank you everyone for that terrific discussion. And thank you to our audience for joining us today from around the globe. To support AJC's vital work around the world, please visit ajc.org/donate. Please stay safe and healthy. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.